What's up, everyone? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Bucks. And today, on Fridays with Frank, we're talking defense. The Bucks defense, individually, we know that they have the players to be a dominant defensive unit. But as we've seen over the last few seasons, they have slipped back in the overall rankings. And potentially, if you're looking at wins and losses and seedings heading into the postseason, that could have a big impact on where this team finishes heading into the postseason. So we're going to break it all down. Let's get started.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Bucks. I'm your host, Kane Pittman. You can see and hear me on this show Monday to Friday, and also find my other stuff over at ESPN alongside me, the founder of BrewHoop.com and longtime voice of the podcast, Frank Madden, for today's episode that is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. That's BetOnline, where the game starts. And as always, thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen or first watch of every day. And if you're subscribed, you can keep up with every episode that drops on whatever platform it is that you're joining us on. And we're approximately, by my count, as we're recording this, about 48 hours away, or just a touch under, from preseason basketball, which I had to double check this morning because it feels crazy that there will be a post-game pod at some point early next week or across the weekend. Anyway, as you can still tell, I'm still in a hotel room, which, by the way, Frank, shout out to the, or actually, I probably shouldn't jinx this, but shout out to the hotel Wi-Fi so far. I did have someone on YouTube ask me if I'd time traveled back to 2005. There may have been some quality issues with the video on YouTube, but I think for the most part, we've battled through. I think we've done a decent job here.
It doesn't matter what setup I use. I feel like my audio is always the worst of anyone that I podcast with. And when we did the pod with Eric Name and JJ Bursch last week, it was this big, Kane, I was really appreciating you and what you do as the producer and editor of this podcast, because I had JJ and Eric in, and my audio, I was using my Mac. I split between a Mac and a Windows when I do this. I always use the same headphones. People recognize this little orange cord, and for some reason it wasn't working, and it was just a total disaster. We probably waited 20 minutes. JJ and Eric were just talking to each other, catching up, and I was flailing around trying to get my audio to work. And finally I just said screw it, and I literally just went no headphones, anything. And that's why my audio was so bad on Friday. It was because literally it was just the regular mic on the computer doing it. So Kane, I'll never underappreciate the work you do to make this podcast sound good. Even though I for some reason just never seem to sound quite as good as everybody else. I mean, JJ was there with the iPod earbuds plugged in, and it sounded way better than I sound with this supposedly better headset. So I don't know. Go figure.
The equipment, I mean, we're not, as most people have discovered at this point, we're not in a professional studio. I stole this Yeti mic from someone at the office here in Sydney. So I don't know how or when I'm going to get it back to them, but as far as I'm concerned, it might be mine. So we're doing our best. But let's talk defense. So I do think, big picture, this is a fascinating storyline for the Bucks and potentially their success in the regular season. So on paper, if you just say, okay, let's look at the top three defenders on the Bucks, with Jrue Holiday, Giannis, Brook, Lopez in no order, you're looking at guys that over the last few years have been all defensive players. And certainly, with Jrue, we would like to think that he would get a bit more recognition for what he does defensively on an individual level. Giannis is going to be a perennial defensive player of the year candidate, already has one in the bag. So on paper, you say, okay, well, this should be a team that finishes top 5 in defense in their sleep. But as we've seen over the last few years, as potentially the Bucks have tried different things in the regular season, as guys have taken more time off. Last year, as Brook Lopez missed 70 games, it's not necessarily a juggernaut night in, night out in the regular season. So I think you've got the numbers there just in terms of where they've sat really in the Budenholzer era. But overall, last year, with all those factors in mind, they really did fall back to kind of a middle-of-the-pack defense, which is kind of humorous because then you look what they did in the postseason. Yes, they had offensive struggles, but they were elite defensively in the postseason.
Yeah, I think I feel like we really got spoiled those first 2 years of the Bud era defensively, right? I mean, they were great the first year, depending on where you looked, first or second in the first year, and then the second year they were by far the best defense in the league. And so, it felt like, oh crap, like they've really found, the formula here. And I think part of that was, you look at kind of the league's defenses. Offense has been on the rise the past couple of years anyway. You look at kind of where net ratings offensive defensive ratings were, like they've generally trended up here the last couple of years. And I think we've seen a number of teams, like, there was this trend that we saw between that second year and the third year when they had the drop off from roughly like first by a mile to like 10th. We saw a lot of the teams that were basically elite defenses that gave up tons of threes shifted from being like the best defenses in the league, like, the Bucks and Raptors and Celtics and those teams. I think Clippers may have been in there too. All those teams had like little bit of a drop off, if I recall correctly. And so people may remember there was this bit of this discussion of like, oh, well, has offense basically caught up to the fact that, if your basic sort of philosophy is we're going to, let you shoot threes, but we're going to take away all the other stuff. And the Bucks are probably the most extreme example of that, right? Taking away everything at the rim, no second chances, no free throws. So really, you've got to just make threes, or you're going to lose to us. It seemed like there was a bit of a shift that just wasn't as successful in terms of just aggregate, defensive performance. But I think last year, obviously, we didn't really get a chance to test out, like, okay, was the 2021 season, when ironically they win an NBA championship, like how much of that was actually a fluke? I think part of what we've seen the past 2 years has been certainly more experimentation during the regular season. I think there's been certainly less of a concern about like, we're just going to be really good at this single style that, is optimized for sort of the average regular season game against the average regular season team with our zone drop. And instead, we're going to try different things and, at times experiment, even when, maybe it's not the optimal strategy to play on a given night. And then obviously last season, the big issue, was clearly the absence of Brook Lopez. So I think this season is definitely a really interesting litmus test for, knock on wood, Brook Lopez hopefully being healthy, hopefully Giannis being healthy, hopefully Jrue Holiday and the rest of the kind of core rotation guys being healthy, so we can get a read on, okay, in the year 22-23, what exactly does this type of defense with a team that maybe doesn't always play 48 minutes of really intense defense at this stage, where does that put you in terms of league rankings? And to me, that's going to be really the kind of the swing factor to a large extent, I think, as far as how good of a regular season team the Bucks can be. And I think the interesting thing about looking at last year's numbers were that many of sort of the fundamentals, even without Brook Lopez, were really similar. So even without Brook, and as good as he is boxing out and increasing the team's rebound effectiveness, even though he doesn't really grab many himself, they were second in defensive rebound rate, they were second in free throw rate, and they were 26th in turnover percentage, which is pretty much mirroring what they had done in previous years, where again, no second chances, they don't give you anything at the foul line, and the general kind of more conservative approach they played also doesn't result in many turnovers. So I think that was really interesting. I mean, there were some subtle shifts. So they went from second to fifth in opponent share of shots at the rim. Not shocking, right? We know Brook is obviously a big deterrent, and going from Brook to Bobby Portis, and then kind of the smorgasbord of other guys playing center, right? Everybody from Boogie to Mamu to Serge when he was trying to sort of figure things out late in the year, and maybe more Giannis at center. So a bit of an uptick in terms of opponent shots at the rim, but again, they didn't allow the second chances, they didn't allow free throws, and I think probably the area you most saw Brook's absence when you look at the numbers was in the opponent field goal percentage at the rim. So they were fourth 2 years ago. Last year it dips all the way to 13th. Again, not shocking. And they really didn't do other stuff to compensate for that, right? And I think the obvious one was that turnover rate, right? Like, okay, if you're going to play smaller, if you're going to play more aggressive, right? Bobby Portis playing higher on pick and rolls, hedging hard, doing different things. You would hope that maybe, hey, you'd get some more turnover or something like that. Obviously, that didn't happen. The paints in the point. There we
Here
go.
we go.
Great throwback.
Zach Lowe will be thrilled.
Paints in the point. Points in the paint. It actually was pretty much flat from year to year. And again, points in the paint are not, I would say a great advanced metric or anything like that, but it's an interesting shorthand just to see like, our team scoring closer to the basket or further away. So I think that's, just one of these, again, things that it was an interesting year because in some ways, things were very similar, and then on some things on the margin they were worse. And I think the other constant, right, was the 3-point defense. And you might say, well, I think sometimes there's been this sense that, well, Lopez playing Brook and playing the zone drop, like that's leading to more 3-point attempts. But I mean, they were dead last again last year in terms of above the break rate of 3-pointers allowed. So there wasn't like some magic tonic that Brook Lopez being out helped them cut down on opponent 3-point attempts. And to be honest, I don't know that's really that shocking, right? Because to me, like Brook is one of those guys. It's not like they're having to send an extra guy to play in the pick and roll when they're running that 2-man game, right? Normally it's just Brook and a guy going over the screen. It's pretty much 2-on-2, and certainly they might help a little bit on the tag the roll man, things like that. But I think we saw last year, like again, Brook's not like just some huge issue that you can't defend the 3-point line with him on the floor. So yeah, and again, not that giving up a lot of 3-pointers is something that only bad teams do. Again, some of the kind of best defenses in the league give up a lot of threes. I mean, the Raptors famously give up just like hemorrhage corner threes, even though Nick Nurse we think of as this great defensive mastermind. So again, it's all about balance. And I think the other part obviously too is just luck in terms of opponent 3-point shooting. And I think what we saw last year early in the season when they were top 10 defensively for a while, even when Boogie was in there, they were top 10 the first few months of the season. They started the year, if I remember correctly, like looking very lucky from 3-point range, and ended up, the opponent 3-point numbers were pretty low. And again, probably a lot of luck going into that. And then ultimately it began to mean revert a bit as the year went on. And I thought the year before in 2021, they were 29th in opponent 3-point percentage overall on threes, 39.3%. So I had hoped last year, hey, hopefully they'll be better on defense this year because they can't get any more unlucky basically in terms of opponent 3-point shooting. And it got better, 36% last year. That was 19th in the league. So, it was, again, not like they got super lucky or anything like that. But, given some of the other issues and the lack of rim protection, the drop off with Brook out, net, they were still a little bit worse defensively. So yeah, I mean, again, I think as much as we might talk about the Bucks trying different things, playing a little bit differently here and there, differences in terms of personnel and playing a little differently with different guys, ultimately the outline, the statistical profile of this team defensively has still been very similar. And I would expect it to be, again, pretty similar this coming season. And I think, again, just going to come down to probably the level of engagement. And I think one thing I would say, we talked about, bringing back the full roster, but having that full roster, hopefully for the full season. Hopefully you have Wes Matthews for a full season. You have Javon Carter for a full season. And Serge Ibaka, I don't know how much he's got left in the tank, but as we saw early in the season, Mamu was being forced to play center at times and really struggled at that spot. They're going to have, I think, better depth unless, again, a lot of injuries strike from a defensive standpoint. So fingers crossed that they can get back to kind of that top 10 side. But I don't know. I could see anything. I could see them being average again and just sort of trying to outscore teams, or I could see them actually rebounding a fair bit and getting back to maybe a top 5 to 7 defense. Because as you said, the talent is not the question.
Well, if you're interested in that, what the defense could potentially play a big part in, that would be the win total, which you can find at betonline.net. We've discussed that. Last time I looked, I think it was around 51.5, which feels kind of low, but for all the reasons we've discussed, how are the Bucks going to treat the regular season? Are they going to try and go on a revenge tour and get the number 1 seed? Who knows? But depending on how you feel about that, you can check it out at betonline.net, which is the number 1 source for basketball and also football betting info this season. So you can find out all the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth articles and analysis on every game that is on the schedule. It's the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite games and events, including baseball, MMA, boxing, and golf. Maybe the Women's World Cup as well. I don't know that for a fact, but it's on right now, down to the Final Four, potentially heading for a USA-Australia gold medal match tomorrow. That would be fun. Not sure I like Australia's chances, but hey, you got to be in it to win it. So head to betonline.net now or use your mobile device to learn more. That's BetOnline, where the game starts. I want to continue on the three-point shooting a little bit, though, because this is clearly, if you scroll Twitter, talk to the fans, this is clearly the biggest source of annoyance in terms of, as you said, a lot of the times they would prefer to give up above the break threes, which the numbers suggest is a decent play compared to shots at the rim and certainly compared to corner threes. I would have to go back and watch the game, which is not really something that I want to absolutely
Game
do.
7?
But it did feel that, Grant Williams, for instance, was a guy that they were like, okay, well, we're going to play the numbers game here. We're going to play the math game. But I wonder, again, the Bucks defensive rating for that series, I think, was around 96, 97. Yeah, they were in the series and they could have won the game if they had had any offense themselves. And I just looked at the numbers to remind myself. So Boston were 22 for 55. So 40% is pretty high. You don't want to be going up against that in game 7. But let's not forget that the Bucks shot 12% from 3 in game 7. So, I look at the defense and we've seen with the personnel that the Bucks have that they can very clearly, we talk about seeding in the regular season and what that means. But when it gets to the postseason, they can very clearly turn it up to a new level. You would like some balance on the offensive end with knocking down some threes yourself. Because to me, did you walk away from that furious about the 3-point defense, I guess is the question that I'm asking from that series?
I mean, I think in game 7, it got a bit out of hand where, it seemed like they were just sort of selling out so hardcore and just really just praying that Grant Williams and company would miss those open threes, which was annoying, right? Because ultimately they didn't miss. I think one of the core, if I was going to highlight one core frustration with the Bucks defense, it's not that they play a zone drop because, they've won an NBA championship. They've been an elite defense playing that way. And again, I think one of the, obviously when they winning that championship, they also were able to play smaller and more versatilely. But I think people also overstate the degree to which they actually played like Giannis at center lineups that playoff run. I don't have numbers in front of me right now, but it was not nearly as much as you might think. I think it was like 10 or 15% of lineups or something like that. It was really not a ton, but they could do it late in games. And, with PJ and his versatility plus Jrue and Giannis and just the way those guys can play, again, it just allows you to be really malleable. And, Giannis in particular, I think a lot of times people just automatically default to when Giannis is playing as a center that, you can switch. But the beauty of Giannis is you can kind of do anything. And, you think about like his signature defensive play of his career, the block of the alley-oop on DeAndre Ayton. The beauty of that play is he's truly playing like a center field where he's essentially coming up a bit on Devin Booker, but he's not switching onto Devin Booker.
Yeah.
And he's just so gifted and reads the play so perfectly well that basically he's able to force Devin Booker to make a decision, and then he's able to recover on the backside and block the shot. So, ultimately having, those cheat code type players, and I think with Giannis and Jrue, you have 2 of them plus Brook, who, despite being up there in age, remains just, an absolute mountain of a human being, and is going to be just very difficult to get around. And he's such a, I think people underrate just how cerebral he is. And I know Eric has written a fair bit about kind of the way he thinks the game, and the way he tags guys to avoid 3-second violations and things like that, right? Like he's just a very, I mean, it's not a, he's a unique guy in that he didn't come into the league as a defensive ace, right? He was a guy that people thought was a bad defender for the first decade of his career or something like that, and then really reinvented himself in this system, and has been awesome, for the Bucks, and has, an all defensive team to show for it, and an NBA championship to show for it. So yeah, but I think the over helping, not to bury lead here, but I think to me the frustration is they still have this tendency, somebody's driving at Brook, and the guy from the weak side will come over and, try to show an extra body, or, someone's driving at Giannis, and, a wing comes over, drifts over into no man's land, and that leads to an open guy on a kick out or something like that. I think that's, to me, just sort of always been the frustration. And I think if you look at a series like that Sun series, I thought they did a really good job of just, and again, some of it's just because you're playing so damn hard because it's the NBA Finals, that I think they were more committed. They closed out harder, and blah blah blah, stuff you may not do in a random game in January. But the corner three, and people may remember, right? Like Suns got basically no corner threes. They don't take tons of threes anyway, but the 3-point attempt numbers were generally very low in that series. And I think a lot of that just is to the credit of the Bucks being able to actually play, one-on-one, not send extra guys to create opportunities for, Chris Paul and other guys to make plays and bend the defense. So again, that would probably be my biggest season, is just, somebody's driving at Brook Lopez, just let them. Just whatever, like if you think you can score on Giannis or Brook, like just let them, and kind of see what happens, because I think you generally should like your odds in those scenarios. And you think about like the Jazz defense, right? The Sixers defense, those defenses, I'm not sure what they did last year, but historically those defenses allowed relatively few threes, and kind of like were a little bit more of like tried to find the balance of the best of both worlds. Maybe weren't as extreme as the Bucks were in terms of just cutting off everything at the rim, but having good rim protectors. They were able to kind of just like let those big guys, by themselves protect the rim well enough, and then be able to cover off on the perimeter. And obviously that's not the Bucks philosophy, and I'm not going to sit here and say the Bucks need to rethink the entire premise behind a lot of defensive principles, because it's worked for them. But I think there's maybe a little bit of more of a compromise they can make there between the helping and honestly just letting these elite rim protectors and Giannis and Brook do what they do best.
So you mentioned PJ Tucker there at the beginning, and I don't know how many times we both mentioned the sentence or the phrase PJ Tucker replacement. So I guess we've discussed the regular season, but into the postseason,
Jordan Nwora, right?
Clearly that addition. He said he's learned some lessons in the offseason, and I'm a trusting man. So
he's worked on his defense in the offseason. Okay, cool.
He has. So getting into the postseason, so that was such a perfect addition for that run. Do we, or the Bucks, need a similar type player? Because they don't necessarily have that guy. I guess that there's some belief or hope that Joe Ingles will be an addition in terms of different lineup versatility that you could potentially have. But again, he's coming off the ACL. He's 35. Actually, similar vintage to PJ Tucker. So maybe the added youth of Joe Ingles is what they're going for there. But there's been discussion around Jay Crowder in recent times, who wants to leave Phoenix. So are they missing anything in terms of a final piece to the puzzle defensively?
I mean, I think if you had a Crowder type, I think that would be a really nice addition. Again, I think the thing that gives you anxiety about adding Ingles, and the questions about, can he defend at a, close enough, well enough to to be, I don't want to say be playable because I think that term is sort of overused, but to not compromise not overly compromise the defense. It's one thing if you have one of those guys on the floor, but I think the concern, we talked about the likely rotation. If you're playing Bobby Portis and Grayson Allen and Joe Ingles, again, not that you're playing all those guys at the same time, but playing one, having to kind of hide one or compensate for one of those guys being a bit of a target when they're out there. Okay, I think you can kind of manage around that to an extent, but if you've got multiple of those guys on the floor, again, you can only attack one of those guys one-on-one necessarily at a time, but it is obviously just harder to kind of work around hiding those guys. And then just from a team defense standpoint, obviously, if you've got multiple guys that are not plus team defenders, then it just puts that extra pressure on the other guys, right? And I mean, again, if anybody can absorb that pressure, it's people like Giannis and Jrue. But one of the things we've seen in terms of the numbers the past few years, because one of the things I was kind of wondering when I was looking at last year was, well, how much of that is just, they were so dependent on Giannis on both ends that they just completely fell apart when Giannis was off the floor. And as you'd expect, they were, way better when Giannis was on the floor, obviously, plus 10 net. It was, I think they were roughly even when he was off the floor in 2021. Last year, they were, I believe, -3 when he was off the floor, which is by far the worst that they've been when Giannis has been on the bench since the Bud era started. They were actually very kind of easily in the positive range with Giannis on the bench in the first 2 years, which is very impressive, I would say, and also kind of a testament to Chris Middleton and Brook and the rest of those guys in those couple years.
So you want them to trade? Well, they don't even need to trade. You want them to sign Eric Bledsoe? Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. Buoy those second unit lineups. But I was looking at it, and even the Giannis on court defensive numbers have trended clearly down the last couple of years. I think last year with him on the floor, they were like in the 71st percentile. Previous year, 80 something percentile. In the first 2 years, 98, 99th percentile or whatever. So even with Giannis on the floor, they, were not an uber elite defense by any stretch last year. And I think that obviously speaks to Brook being out, right? Giannis is the ultimate, he makes up for pretty much, so many sins of others, right? I mean, Bobby Portis defensively, the Bobby Portis numbers last year defensively with him on the floor were actually quite good, which, Bobby deserves credit, but you also give lots of credit to Giannis since they were playing so much time together and I think kind of figured out, how to work together. But there are limits to that. And certainly Giannis plus Brook was, I mean, one of the best defensive tandems in the league, certainly among, kind of 4 or 5 combinations. And interesting now, right, to see teams try to go with these jumbo lineups. Most notably the Wolves trading for Rudy Gobert. And again, obviously, Karl Towns at the 4 is not Giannis at the 4, right? Offensively, he's extremely dynamic, but defensively, obviously, you're trying to hide Karl Towns. But we'll see kind of how that jumbo lineup works. And then in Cleveland, I think probably the better analog is the Cavaliers having Evan Mobley and Jared Allen, and what they're doing. And we saw obviously a lot of success from them defensively last year. And I think what the Bucks did was maybe sort of a preview of the success that they've had and what I expect they'll continue to have. So yeah, I think I'm just really curious to see how good they can be, how good they want to be, because as we've talked about, I think one of the themes we saw last year was, for 3 quarters, the Bucks probably felt like they could kind of just outscore teams, and then fourth quarter comes, they sort of lock in and say, okay, Jrue, Wes, Chris, Giannis, and obviously Bobby was in there a lot, Pat Connaughton, whatever it might be, whatever the lineups might be, they were able to lock in, lock down, Jrue and Wes and Chris and Giannis, right? Like those guys are very switchable, so you can't kind of easily compromise and bend the defense if you're just running actions with those guys. So I imagine obviously you expect a similar formula this year, but do they maybe put in a little bit more in the first 3 quarters? I think that'll be something that obviously will be interesting to watch. And hopefully with Brook back again, your depth is just better. And I think too, I mean, with Serge, we'll see how much they actually play Serge. His defensive numbers were not great last year, but I think you would still expect that in this system, he's not young. He's a little bit more mobile than Brook. My hope is that he can get into a pretty good groove. I'm not expecting him to be like, when Robin Lopez was here, who underrated part of that awesome year 2 of the Bud era, right? I think he was a huge part of how good they were defensively, because you had, essentially like very little drop off going from an all defensive big in Brook to his twin brother in Robin off the bench. So I don't think we're going to quite see that necessarily, but having a guy like Serge that you probably don't even need to play most nights, but you can. Hopefully he's feeling fit, coming now a year away from that back surgery, and hopefully that translates into better performance again. Whether that becomes something that ever matters in the playoffs, probably not, right? But certainly from regular season perspective, he's a guy that you hope can actually impact things. And by the way, as we talk about Serge, I'm always like a bit like wary of saying like, "Oh, bounce back year for Serge Ibaka." It's like we don't even know how old Serge is, right? He could be like 36 years old. But on the flip side, was listening to some podcasts about the Celtics, and 2 months ago we're talking about how the Celtics, how ridiculously deep they are, and now with everything that's happened, Gallinari hurt, and more importantly, Robert Williams. We mentioned the other 8 to 12 weeks, and then I think it was on the Windhorse pod. I think they mentioned that it was 8 to 12 weeks before he can resume basketball activities. So it's not even like 8 to 12 weeks and he's back, but 8 to 12 weeks and then he can start doing stuff. So could be quite a while before he's back. And the phrase, I think Tim Bontemps might have like made some reference to the Celtics really like Luke Cornett, at which point I was like, wow, we're in September and it's reached this, trying to make it sound like the Celtics are, optimistic about Luke Cornett's role in on their roster, which, again, Luke Cornett, son of Bucks great Frank Cornett, and did have his cup of coffee as a COVID signing last year. And I think he got into like he might have played in that Nets blow. Remember when they went to Brooklyn and they beat the crap out of the Nets? I think Jrue was hurt right before they beat the Warriors. And I think Luke Cornett got into that game, I want to say, and, did not distinguish himself at all. But anyway, so it could be worse, right? We could be trying to talk ourselves into Luke Cornett, but, hopefully Serge Ibaka has something left. And if not, then he just won't play in the playoffs again.
So this morning I recorded, we basically split all the NBA franchises into, there's the contending groups, the tanking groups, and whatever was in between. I don't know. Anyway, to no surprise, the Bucks were in the contending group. So we recorded that podcast a little bit earlier tonight. And our friend John Corrales from the Boston Celtics also mentioned Luke Cornett in that podcast. And I was a little taken aback by it at the time. It was very early over here in Australia, and I wasn't expecting to hear from Luke Cornett. But it does remind me, if you play fantasy basketball and you're looking for some value late in the draft from a guy that might play that nobody has any interest in, Luke Cornett could be your guy. But listen to Josh Lloyd on the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast. Josh Lloyd hosts the #1 daily fantasy basketball show on the planet. It's free and available wherever you get your podcasts. Of course, listen to that after you listen to Locked On Bucks, though. That's the most important thing. So Bucks and Grizzlies, Saturday night. I just had to Google daylight saving starts here, so I was probably going to give you the wrong time, but I believe it's 7 p.m. Central Time, Saturday night. Bucks and Grizzlies, preseason opens up. I'm sure we'll chat about it at some point, Frank. I'm actually flying. I'm in the air during that game, so I'll go home, watch a replay, just be happy to be home. And
this game totally snuck up on me too. I had no idea that there was an actual NBA basketball game this weekend. And then I think is there 5 days off, 4 or 5 days off until the Abu Dhabi games. So hopefully this game actually gets to finish, unlike last year when what was it, the fire alarm or something, and the game just was called and Chris Middleton was eating wings in the post game hoping that the game wasn't going to have to be restarted. So that was not the kind of eventful first preseason game that maybe we were hoping for. And do you think Giannis plays in this game?
Probably. He generally shows up in the first one, doesn't he? But then again, as we've discussed, he's obviously probably going to play the Abu Dhabi game. So, look,
I'm going to say that he doesn't play because it's in Memphis, right? So it's not like a home game or anything, right? It's in Memphis.
no, it's in Milwaukee.
Oh, it's in Milwaukee. Okay, then I'd say probably more likely that he plays. Yeah.
Either way, my recommendation for those that can afford it is I don't know if I'd be spending $4 on the season. Unless you're a big fan of Jordan Nwora. I'd say Marjon Beauchamp. That'll be fun, Frank. First appearance with the Bucks. I'm excited for that.
Yeah, we didn't. I mean, we talked all podcasts about defense. We didn't talk about him.
Yeah,
Again,
sure.
I think it's hard to put high expectations on a rookie to come in and immediately be an impact defender. As much as Herb Jones was that guy for the Pelicans last year, I don't think we usually see a Herb Jones type guy come along and deliver that sort of immediate defensive impact on the wing. But we'll see. I mean, as we said, I think one of the big questions, as we talked about for the preseason, is Marjon's defense versus Jordan Nwora's offense, and can Jordan Nwora distinguish himself at all, or show the effort and discipline defensively to impress Bud? Can Marjon make some open threes and maybe show a little bit more versatility offensively than we saw in Vegas? Which again, I don't know that Bud's going to worry too much if he's hitting open threes and playing solid defense. He's going to probably put himself in a pretty good spot to play until Chris Middleton and eventually Joe Ingles come back. But yeah, it's just nice to have rookies that can actually see regular season playing time and have something to kind of look forward to. So NBA basketball, it's been a minute.
Saturday night, as I said, the Bucks are back, and then just to your point, Frank, Thursday morning hoops in Milwaukee, 11 a.m. That game will tip off against the Hawks in Abu Dhabi. So take the day off. You get the. I say it's okay. Don't worry about your boss. You can have the day off Thursday. Watch the Bucks and the Hawks in an absolute preseason classic. All right, let's be back next week. We'll talk about the game. Maybe we'll talk about Marjon Beauchamp's Rookie of the Year hopes. That would be fun. We'll speak to you guys after the weekend.